Dry season central Brazil. A field crate sits at the edge of the Cerrado, and inside it, something is breathing. Slow, deliberate, patient, with claws the length of a butcher's knife folded against its chest, waiting for the latch to open. The ground beneath that crate had not absorbed rainfall in years. The top 30 centimeters baked into a crust, so compacted by termite activity that water sheeted off it like concrete, pooling at the edges and evaporating before it ever reached a root. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years watching ecosystems fail and, on rare occasions, recover, and I have never stood in a landscape that felt more exhausted than this one. 30 centimeters of dead crust, and beneath it, an entire savanna waiting. What was already happening across this region before any animal arrived is the part people skip over, and it is the part that makes everything that follows make sense. For over a decade, synthetic pesticide programs had been running across the Cerrado, spraying termite-dense zones in an attempt to restore soil permeability, at a cost that climbed year after year with no measurable ecological return. Those programs consumed hundreds of millions in public and agricultural funding across 12 years of continuous application. And the termite pressure did not decline. The mounds kept growing, the soil kept sealing, the Cerrado kept losing. Now, think about what that means for a moment. Every year the chemical option ran, the soil biology it was meant to protect fell further behind. And the argument for returning the animal that evolution had been engineering for 25 million years grew harder to ignore. 5 giant anteaters were released into a single patrol corridor in the Cerrado. Within 72 hours, every mound in that corridor showed fresh excavation marks. Not survey marks, not probing. Full claw-strike excavations, the animals working the ground like they had never stopped. Dr. Flavia Souza, a soil ecologist with Instituto Pro Carnívoros, was the first researcher to log an excavation event in the project's field record, and she noted something that stopped her mid-sentence when she read it back to her own team. The claw-strike depth exceeded every single estimate in the pre-release model documented in 2019. Stay with this. Because what Souza recorded in 2019 was not just an animal feeding, it was a soil event, a physical disruption of compacted substrate at a depth that no synthetic program had ever reached without machinery. The question of how deep that strike went and what it triggered in the soil column below it is exactly where this story is heading. 5 animals, 1 corridor, 72 hours, and a number written in a field log that made a room full of scientists go quiet. Not because it was impossible, but because it was exactly what 25 million years of engineering should have always been able to do. Like it should, dry grass bending in low wind, twisted Quora tea trees casting short shadows across a wide, amber horizon, and a stillness that reads, convincingly, as rest. It was not resting. Baseline surveys conducted in the seasons before the reintroduction found a landscape moving in one direction only, not dormant, not recovering, but actively narrowing, simplifying, sealing itself shut from the inside out. Near Amas National Park in the northern Cerrado, termite mound density had climbed to approximately 4,000 mounds per square kilometer. The substrate between them compressed so thoroughly that boots left no impression and rainfall simply sheeted off the surface without sinking a centimeter. Here is where it gets interesting, because the collapse was not local, it was geographic and it was systematic, and Dr. Flavia Souza at Instituto Pro Carnívoros mapped it location by location before a single reintroduction crate was ever unlatched. In Mato Grosso do Sul, surveys recorded fewer than 3 breeding giant anteater populations in a region that once supported dozens, their absence written not in any record, but in the shape of the crust itself. Along the Araguaia drainage, topsoil carbon had fallen to roughly half the concentration measured in adjacent gallery forest, an invisible deficit that no aerial image could detect. In the Tocantins transition zone, native grass diversity had declined to fewer than 12 distinct varieties in degraded sectors, a grassland made simple, made fragile, made silent. And in the EMAS buffer sectors, water infiltration rates had dropped so severely that the seed bank sealed beneath the hardpan was effectively unreachable, tens of thousands of hectares locked in biological stasis. Sousa described her own baseline readings later, as the measurements of a system that had forgotten what disturbance was supposed to feel like. A phrase that stayed with me because it is the most precise ecological diagnosis I have heard in 40 seasons of fieldwork. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Sousa's pre-reintroduction data, logged across 3 consecutive dry seasons from 2016 through 2018, showed invertebrate diversity reduced to near monoculture conditions in 560-hectare survey blocks. Not degraded, not simplified, but functionally collapsed into a single-species substrate that no longer regulated itself. A savanna that has lost its engineers looks exactly like one that still has them, right until the rain falls and slides away. You are forming a question right now, and it is the right one. If the surface looked whole and the collapse was this deep, this wide, this silent, what exactly did 5 reintroduced individuals encounter when they hit the ground for the first time? The data Sousa pulled in 2019 answers that precisely, and it is where we are going next. Because what those 5 individuals encountered was not a savanna in recovery. It was a 560-hectare biological exam, and every claw strike they made in the first 72 hours was being recorded by instruments Sousa had already placed at 14 monitoring stations before dawn on release day. We're already reading soil pressure before the first anteater took a single step into the open corridor. And what they recorded in the opening hours rewrote every assumption the Agricultural Coalition had put in writing. For 12 consecutive years, extension programs across the Cerrado corridor had been applying synthetic termiticide to degraded pasture zones. Not once, not twice, but on a mandatory annual cycle, because the treatment wore off and the colonies returned within one growing season every single time. 12 years of documented treatment, 12 annual budget allocations. And at the end of that period, not a single peer-reviewed field report recorded measurable recovery of soil, invertebrate diversity in any treated zone across the corridor. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. The chemical addressed the insect. It said nothing to the soil. Compaction continued uninterrupted through every treatment cycle, and the hard pan that sealed the seed bank below kept deepening, a centimeter at a time, season after season. Against that 12-year record, 5 anteaters operating across their natural home range achieved measurable mound disruption within the first dry season. No reapplication schedule, no budget line, no compound that sterilized a 2-meter radius around every target colony. A single anteater tongue, 60 centimeters of densely muscled tissue cycling at up to 150 strokes per minute. Extracted termites from a depth that no surface-applied chemical had reached without machinery during that entire 12-year window. Sousa's field record from 2019 put the claw strike depth below every figure the pre-release model had projected. The institutional resistance was real, and it was documented. A regional agricultural coalition filed a formal objection in the approval period, citing 2 specific risks: infrastructure damage and boundary crossing into managed farmland. The animals later proved both concerns accurate and irrelevant at the same time. What you need to sit with is this. The objection letter ran to several pages, detailing projected costs the anteaters might generate. Dr. Flavia Sousa noted in her project correspondence from that period that not a single paragraph addressed what the pesticide program had already failed to do over 12 years of uninterrupted application. The claw strike Sousa, logged in 2019, disrupted compacted substrate at a depth no synthetic program had touched without powered equipment. That single physical event, repeated across 560 hectares by 5 animals operating on instinct, constituted what her record formally classified as a soil event, not a feeding event. The anteater charged nothing. It carried no label, filed no invoice, and required no reapplication. And what those 5 animals did to the soil structure in that first dry season set in motion a cascade of ecological consequences that the pesticide program, across 12 years and every dollar spent, had never once approached. What happened to the soil itself once the disruption began? Once 40-centimeter strikes started opening the hard pan, and the seed bank below it had its first contact with air in over a decade, is the part of this story that the monitoring data from those 14 stations captured in detail. That is precisely where we are going. It was a sequence of physical events, each one triggering the next, as precise and mechanical as anything that happens in a laboratory, except it was happening in open air under a Brazilian sun, initiated by a single curved claw. A 15-centimeter curved claw drives into the face of a termite mound, and the column of compacted substrate that opens up is roughly 30 centimeters deep and 20 centimeters wide, a channel that the surrounding Earth has not had in longer than the monitoring record reaches. That opening is not a feeding wound. It is the first air pocket the compacted substrate at that survey point has experienced in the entire monitored record. And the difference between sealed ground and aerated ground is the difference between a locked door and an open corridor for everything that follows. Within 72 hours of a disruption event, dung beetles, drawn by the anteaters' own droppings and by the freshly loosened substrate around the mound, arrive and begin tunneling downward, extending the aeration network below the original strike zone without any direction from anyone. Dr. Flavia Sousa, soil ecologist with Instituto Pro Carnívoros, and the first researcher to log an excavation event in the project's field record, documented in 2019 what happened when the next rain arrived at an active excavation site. Moisture penetrated past the hardpan layer, something the 14-station monitoring network had never recorded at an undisturbed control point 200 meters away. The sequence the monitoring team mapped runs in strict order: claw strike, air pocket, beetle activity, moisture infiltration, and then, by the second wet season, native grass germination breaking the surface at excavation-adjacent plots, species that had been locked below the crust by compaction pressure for over a decade. Now, you are probably asking whether 5 animals can genuinely alter a corridor measured in tens of thousands of hectares. And that doubt is entirely reasonable, and the answer the satellite mapping produced in the second monitoring year is exactly where we are headed. So, stay with me for what comes next. As grass diversity expanded at excavation sites, the cascade moved up the food web in 4 documented steps. Small mammals re-entered the recovering corridor. Raptor hunting activity, absent from recorded surveys for over 3 consecutive dry seasons, resumed above those same plots. Invertebrate richness climbed at 11 of the 14 monitored stations, and the corridor began functioning as connected habitat rather than fragmented dead ground. Not a single step in that chain was engineered. Every link arrived because the physical conditions the anteater created made it possible. The system had been holding its breath, and the claw gave it permission to exhale. When the monitoring team mapped cumulative excavation events against satellite imagery at the close of the second full monitoring cycle, 5 animals had produced documented disturbance signatures across 560 hectares of previously sealed corridor. A footprint no pre-release model had projected as achievable below a population of 40. What that footprint revealed about the relationship between excavation frequency, mound density, and landscape scale recovery, and what it means for every degraded Cerrado corridor still waiting, is the part of this story the final act is built around. Animals in a time frame the models had reserved for populations 8 times that size. And then those 5 animals did something the models had not budgeted for at all. They walked past the edge of the release zone and kept going. The recovery models had projected home ranges of roughly 9 square kilometers per animal, a figure drawn from radio collar data in protected reserves where food density and terrain kept individuals close. What the eastern edge of the release zone showed within the first dry season was that at least 2 of those individuals had simply declined to comply. An adult giant anteater weighs up to 40 kilograms, and it carries that weight low and forward, moving with the settled, unhurried momentum of something that has never needed to apologize for taking up space. A wire strand along a property line is not a deterrent to an animal that does not recognize the concept of a property line. Farmers along the eastern sector filed reports of disturbed water troughs and torn irrigation covers, and at least one formal complaint reached Instituto Pro Carnívoros in the first year. Not from anger exactly, but from the disorientation of finding your managed land suddenly part of someone else's patrol route. And yet, and this is the part that the complaint forms could not capture, A breeding pair was confirmed in a zone the project had formerly classified as degraded beyond viable anteater habitat, producing offspring that the first phase population model had never anticipated. That offspring represents the sixth animal the release plan did not write. You are probably asking yourself right now whether the habitat classification was simply wrong from the start, or whether the animals changed the site enough to make it viable after arrival. And that question has a specific answer that is coming, so stay with me, because the distinction between those two possibilities reshapes everything the next phase of this project is built on. Dr. Flavia Sousa, soil ecologist with Instituto Pro Carnívoros, the same researcher who in 2019 logged the first strike depth that exceeded every pre-release estimate, returned to a survey plot she had designated as a control site, chosen specifically because she expected zero anteater presence there. What she found redrew her assumptions in a single afternoon. Fresh strike marks on 3 separate termite structures, all within a 100-meter radius of the control plot boundary she had staked herself. She described the moment in a project debrief not as a data correction, but as the point at which she stopped trusting the habitat classification maps and started trusting the animals instead. The animals did not read the habitat assessment, and the habitat responded to the animals, which is precisely the order nature has always worked in, long before we arrived with clipboards and color-coded degradation indices. What the breeding confirmation and the boundary crossings together revealed was that the real constraint on this recovery was never habitat quality, it was population density. And what a second cohort of animals introduced into those classified degraded zones might unlock is the question the final chapter of this project is now being written around. Is the one that changes how you understand everything that came before it. What the Cerrado gave back was not a managed savanna, it gave back a recovering one, and those are fundamentally different things. A managed system is quieter, tidier, and far less honest about what it actually is. A recovering one is loud, unpredictable, and governed entirely by forces that predate every decision we ever made about it. Dr. Flavia Sousa, soil ecologist with Instituto Pro Carnívoros, put it in terms I have not been able to stop thinking about. After 2 full monitoring seasons, more than 700 cumulative field hours logged across the reintroduction site, she still cannot predict with confidence where the next excavation will occur. That is not a data gap. That is the data, because a system you cannot fully forecast is a system that is functioning on its own terms again. And in nearly 4 decades of fieldwork, the inability to predict has always been my most reliable sign that something is genuinely alive. Think about what that means for the way we measure success. We entered this reintroduction looking for confirmation. Confirmation that 5 individuals would behave the way the literature said they would, occupy the corridors we designated, and validate the framework we spent years building. What we got instead was a correction. The correction was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply showed up in Sousa's field record as a claw strike depth that exceeded every pre-existing estimate in a substrate that no synthetic remediation program had reached without heavy machinery. Documented quietly in 2019 in a single line of field notes that rewrote the project's baseline assumptions. Strip this recovery down to its physical law, and you are left with 3 irreducible facts. Remove the pressure that was suppressing the system, return the missing part that the system was built around, and then, this is the part we find hardest, do nothing else. Biology will complete the sequence, not out of hope, out of physics. If you have watched something disappear from your region in your lifetime, a bird, a predator, an insect you used to see every summer, drop its name and your location in the comments below, and yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent, because the evidence, 5 individuals, 1 dry season, and a soil record that nobody predicted, says otherwise. I am Dr. Raymond Finch. I will see you in the field. The next one takes us to the Bieszczady Mountains of Poland, where a reintroduced European bison population now exceeds 1,000 animals and has been actively reshaping the forest understory in less than 1 generation. Visible, measurable, and faster than anyone in authority planned for. The Polish State Forests Directorate opposed the expansion of the bison corridor in 2019, citing timber yield projections. And the corridor expanded regardless, because the trees the bison disturbed regenerated faster than the Directorate's own model said they would. The question the next video answers is this: if the bison are now recovering faster than the forest can absorb their grazing pressure, is the system healing, or entering an imbalance that no historical baseline on Earth can measure?